All right, well, welcome back to the SDSU Northeast Research Farm grass management plots. As you saw in our introductory video from early July, we've got a lot going on out here, and I'll briefly recap that. Today we're launching a series of videos on our plots that have more technical information for you, so you can see how these plots are progressing over time in lieu of being able to host our Grassland Management School here in 2020. So as a brief recap, the plot project focuses on best management practices for grassland restoration, as well as experimenting with some upcoming experimental techniques such as cover cropping, whether a person should till or no-till, various mowing management, fire management, etc. Today we're going to start with our plots that are basically focused on restoration of the native species mix, in particular without cover crops. So what we're going to look at first is four plots that are just planted to what we call a CP37 typical mix that we would get from the Natural Resources Conservation Service. The plot that I'm standing in right now and the next several plots consist of a mix that I'm going to go over that mix for you just once, and then it'll be the same for all four of the next plots. But that native mix includes big blue stem, black-eyed Susan, blanket flower, gray-headed coneflower, green needlegrass, heath aster, hoary verbane, Illinois bundleflower, Indian grass, prairie coneflower, purple prairie clover, showy partridge pea, side oats grandma, slender wheat, switchgrass, western wheatgrass, western yarrow, white prairie clover, and wild bergamot. And that is a mix that was put together with input from NRCS as what we would call maybe an affordable, typical pollinator mix that would meet most of the requirements for most of the CRP type plantings and pollinator plantings. So we're starting here in plot E. And plot E, what I'm going to do is go over the plot history for you on each individual plot, and we'll see what we learn and what we think we're learning. So here on plot E, this is a plot where we did not use any cover cropping. We went straight into a drilled native mix that I just reviewed for you. And the history of this plot is that it was prior to 2017, it was in a typical corn soybean rotation. I would say conventionally farmed. That's what most of our plots would have qualified as. And it was soybean stubble. This was a no-till trial. Soybeans planted and are drilled to our native seed mix in the spring of 2018. During 2018, which is typical of what we would do in establishment, this is one that we call a CRP trial, but even in that establishment year, we took the time to mow this low, very low with a batwing mower 3 times during that first growing season. And that was to combat our common annual weeds, which are common to all of these plots. I'm not going to go over that every single time, but weeds like lamb's quarter, pigweed, mare's tail, barnyard grass, those are kind of our annual weeds that, you know, they don't really matter, but they do provide some competition for our desirables. But then we've also got some of our tougher weeds that you might find. Canada thistle. You can see there's a lot of yellow tall out there. That's our perennial sow thistle. We've had some bull thistle in these plots, etc. So the mowing really gives our native planting somewhat of a competitive edge that first year or two. So in this particular plot, it was mowed 3 times in 2018. In 2019, now because this is a CRP trial plot, we're trying to mimic what most producers would do. The mowing is important, but we did not burn this plot simply because most producers, even though they may desire to burn, it's very difficult to get that burning done. And that burning usually has to happen before the primary nesting season, which is May 1 in South Dakota. So this CRP trial plot did not get burned in 2019 or 2020. Basically, there's been no burn management, just mowing management on here. Now, here in 2020, I did mow it 1 time in late June, and I mowed it high. And now that will be the end of annual management. Again, we're mimicking CRP, so we get about 2 years of establishment where you can kind of do your manipulative management. But after that, it's kind of hands off. So you can see what the results are. We've got a fairly good establishment of our forbs, sunflowers, and our yarrow are near me, gray-headed coneflower. We've got Indian grass coming, we've got big blue stem coming, we've got switchgrass coming, slender wheatgrass that was planted, and a variety of other forbs behind me. So this plot, if as a CRP plot, if this were your CRP field, you'd be fairly happy with the results. Again, this was in a no-till bean field that this was established into. However, we do still have a fair amount of weed pressure, and what we do to treat those weeds in the real world, typically one might be tempted to spray. Now, if this is a managed CRP plot going forward, high clipping is probably the preferred management technique going forward in the real world, just to knock these perennial sow thistles back and to top off the Canada thistle. At scale, clipping can be a little bit daunting if it's bigger than 40 or 60 acres. However, to come in here and spray this would be, in my opinion, a big mistake, because we would be spraying out all of these desirable natives that are now established and coming very well. So it becomes more of an art at this point for managing this plot. And again, my recommendation would be future management. Allow the competition of the native plants to really do their thing. We're seeing a lot of healthy natives, and clip when necessary. So after filming here, I will likely clip this plot high one more time here in late July, break that seed cycle, knock these seeds off before they become established, and then allow the plot to mature through the rest of the growing season. All right, welcome back everyone. It's July 27th here at the Northeast Farm. We just introduced you to plot E, and now we're on plot F. Very similar to the previous plot. What we're experimenting with in this plot is, again, it's a no-till, soybean stubble, drilled native mix, same time frame and everything as the previous plot. The difference on this one is it's not a CRP trial. This is what we're calling an open management trial. Whereas our best management practices we can use at any time, not constricted by time frames or rules, etc. So what we've got behind us is looking very similar to the previous plot. Again, this is on a no-till bean stubble. What we did here, if you'll look to the behind me, we've got a flag. And I did a little bit of a split on this plot as a trial. So in 2019, which was last year, I burned the east half of this only, as you can see off to my east, and I did not burn the west half, in order to see if there's any long-term variability or difference in structure or function of the grassland with more or less intense burning. Okay. Last year you would have seen a pretty stark difference in that year of the burn. Especially by the time late July rolls around. We had a fairly robust native plant community where we burned. It was a little bit suppressed where we didn't burn last year. And we had a fair amount of mature Canada thistle pressure by this time of year on the unburned site. So we did a little bit of mowing last year as well. And we clipped the unburned side fairly high in order to clip off those Canada thistle. Now here in 2020, you can see that every year is different, but this year we burned across the entire site, the entire plot. And you can see that we've got a very strong response of our warm season native plant community. Most all of our forbs that were planted are present, as well as a pretty robust big blue stem, more or less big blue stem dominated grassland at this point. There is switchgrass, Indian grass coming. We've got Canada wild rye that seems to be in fairly good balance in the plant community. But those spring fires do, as we know, promote somewhat of a lean toward our native warm season plant community. Interestingly enough though, because we did a fire across the whole site, the split line that you might see half and half really has seemed to disappear at this point. Visually speaking, there's not a great variability between one side of the plot or the other. If we ran transects or we did something like that, we might see somewhat of a density diversity, but species composition wise, everything is present on both sides of the split. So again, the burn technique here, I believe has, if we really did a comparison on the weed pressure, in my opinion, we've got a little bit less weed pressure, less maturity of our weeds here, especially our thistles. And you know, that's one of the benefits that a later burn, this was burned in late May, so we were able to put some pressure on those thistle plants versus no burning in the previous plot. So I think over time, I speculate that this will be probably a more robust community as we continue to apply burning and mowing management, whereas the previous plot, we're more or less done managing there, other than maybe a high clip here in the next couple of weeks. Welcome back to the SDSU Northeast Farm grass management plots. Again, now we are on our third plot in the series of experimenting with just going into our native mix. Again, these are not plots that we utilize any cover crops on. So this is plot G. Plot G is meant to mimic, again, CRP management, both in the mix and in the timing of not only the planting, but also our management methods that we've utilized. However, the difference on this now is that we are on tilled soybean stubble. So this was a conventional soybean corn crop rotation prior to 2017. It was harvested as beans in the fall of 2017. And we did a light, what I would call a light tillage disking in the spring of 2018 prior to planting. And that happened on or about May 12th in 2018, where it was disked to about a 3 to 4 inch depth. Pretty typical tillage for this part of the world. And so now what I'm showing you is a split of plot G. Behind me is, you can see the flags. So to the east of me, I did a little bit of experimenting with fire, and to the west was no fire. So here's our scenario, or here's our history with this plot. Planted in the native mix, drilled in the spring of 2018. The entire plot was mowed in that year of planting in 2018 to a very short, low mowing 3 times, and that was to suppress our common weeds that I've already discussed, our common annual weeds. That was our 2018 management. In the spring of 2019, I burned the east half of this. And that was to allow a little bit of a sample for what is allowable in our CRP management, where in the year of establishment, or the first couple of years, we can burn. And so that was a late April burn, and that was burned at that time because that's what our fuel load allowed. If I would have waited any longer, it likely wouldn't have burned anyway. And I just wanted to see what the difference might be in this particular plot on that tilled soil. To the west of me was not burned. Now here in 2020, again, because it's CRP, there's no management. We're really trying to press that line of what most producers would do. And if even though there is some weeds in here, it does not warrant, in my opinion, or in the opinion of my co-managers on this, that we would ever recommend that the producer need do much. Now, there is a little bit of bull thistle, a little bit of Canada thistle coming, some perennial sow thistle, but by and large, it's a pretty healthy plot. Interestingly, the line that I'm standing on, I do believe there is some residual effect of that fire. And again, it's all visual. But if you look to the west of me, where there was no spring burning in the spring of 2019, there's an appearance of a more dense population of our planted forbs. Now, whether that's real or not is difficult to assess. It would take some point counts, some transects, etc. The species are there, but you can see we've got a denser plot of sunflowers behind me. We also have a little bit more dominance of maturing Canada wild rye and slender wheatgrass. And then you can see that's the brown grasses that are still, pretty prominent. If our camera pans to the east, where we performed that spring 2019 prescribed burn, again, we've got a lot of Canada wild rye, we've got a lot of slender in there, but it's slightly later. It's not quite as mature. It might arguably be a week behind the west side. And there is appearing to be more occurrence of big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, etc. So again, we've already described what spring fire can do. Again, that was an early spring fire in 2019. Likely it helped suppress some of our weed issues, stimulated some of those natives. But this plot from now going forward will not be managed other than when we hit our 5-year, what we call our midterm management window, unless there is a necessity for a high clipping or something. But at this point, I want to leave this alone. If I was a CRP landowner, we're in the beginning of truly the third growing season, planted in 2018, went through 2019, and now we're here in July 2020. I'm pretty happy with this. I'm pretty happy with my investment of time and energy. Critical to the success of this plot, I believe, was that low clipping 3 times in the year of establishment to really take that weed pressure out. And now it can function pretty well as a CRP plot. Pollinators, good for wildlife, good for upland birds, pheasants, ducks, etc. So I'm happy with this plot. All right, welcome back to the SDSU Northeast Farm Research Plots. It's July 27th. I'm showing you the 4th plot in the series of those plots that did not use cover crops. Now, we've compared various plots up to this point that were or were not within CRP management. This plot is not a non-CRP plot. It's similar to the one I previously showed you in that it was tilled soil. And this is really interesting that both the plot G that I just showed you and this plot H arguably might be the very best plots on the farm, contrary to what we assume is really a desirable soil bed for our native plants. We often prescribe broadcasting or drilling into a hard seed bed right into that stubble. Now we tilled these, and these were tilled. It was you arguably would be a fluffy soil. They were drilled, which may have helped some, but as you can see, it's pretty hard to argue that tillage prior to seeding is necessarily detrimental to the establishment of the natives. Why do we not till? Conventional wisdom is that those grass seeds, or that those seedings do prefer a harder seed bed. The other thing that tillage can do is it can wake up a lot of weeds that may be lower in the soil profile. So there's still good argument to not till prior to planting. However, I can't say that the tillage in this case appears to have been detrimental to the establishment of our plots. So what are we standing in? We're standing in a CP37 mix. I've already reviewed what that mix looks like. On tilled plot, planted in the spring of 2018. And really the difference here on this particular plot was that in the spring of 2019, I conducted there was no prescribed burning on the west side here. In the spring of 2019, April again, late April, we did do a prescribed fire on the east side. Now again, if we would have been here last year on film, we would have seen a pretty stark contrast between the two halves. Whereas we had a little bit more of a thistle issue again on the unburned side last year. Now this year we burned all of it, and this is what is typical of what we call a best management practice fire. This was now burned in 2020 in late May. And what a late May fire did, it was all of the thistle that was coming was at the rosette stage already, those weeds that we wanted to suppress. Even though we had native plants coming already at that time, we know enough about the ecology of those native plants that they can usually take a little bit of a burn at that time of their life stage, their growth stage. And the results are pretty amazing. That late spring burn, you can see had a dramatic positive effect on our warm season grass community. This plot is dominated by big blue stem and Indian grass coming with some switchgrass coming in as well. There's still a healthy population of Canada wild rye, but not as much as those plots that were either burned earlier or not burned at all. And that does seem to be somewhat of the trade-off. We don't have as much of our cool season desirable grasses, which would have been our Canada wild rye, our slender wheat, and even our western wheat, although we didn't know if western wheat would establish all that well in these plots to begin with. We do see that the grasses dominate. There's still the full suite of forbs are out here. So as far as certain wildlife species, given pheasants or those that are looking for escape cover, nesting cover, this is pretty good stuff. Where it gives us pause is to say that, well, what's this going to look like as we go forward if we continue burning on an annual basis, which we will do just to show you over time what can happen. But this may fill in very, very densely with grasses. Be great for hunting, great for escape cover, but it may not be the best brood habitat. If in fact our native forbs are suppressed a little bit, then we've got less flowering, less nectar, less insects, less forage for those chicks, and we've got a very dense plant community that's going to possibly hinder their movement over time and space. So, very happy with the overall health of the plot. If I was a CRP landowner again and this was the result, I would be very pleased. It may not be perfect. It definitely looks the best if you're looking for those tall native grasses. But as far as wildlife cover, wildlife habitat, it may actually be slightly too dense with our native grasses. The trade-off there is this dense native population is doing a phenomenal job of suppressing the weed pressure. There is still some perennial sow thistle stuff here off to my left. By and large, the thistle species that are out here are really being pretty well suppressed. And I would imagine that over time they would go away or become something I wouldn't worry about in the long haul. All right, welcome back to the Grassland research plots at the Northeast Farm. Today it's July 27th again, and we are looking at a series of plots where we use cover crops. The team decided that we wanted to do some pre-cropping with cover crops in order to test some of the emerging science of cover crops and soil health and grassland restoration. So the idea here was using cover crops in such a way to prep the soil and the plots for the future planting of these natives. And I guess it really revolved around three things. It revolved around the idea that the cover crops should, one, allow any chemical residue in the soil or any chemical carryover to mellow out, dissipate, and not inhibit the germination of our more expensive prairie plants. The second thing was that we felt that the cover crops would allow that soil biology to start rolling a little bit better, maybe prep the soil in such a way that it would be more conducive to our native plants. And the third thing was to test the theory that, will these cover crops, possibly even if mixed directly with native species, serve as a kind of a nurse crop and again help overall stimulation of that native plant community. Okay. That was the theory, and that's the emerging science kind of cutting edge of where we're at today with an understanding of covers and the manipulation of soils with covers for native species. We are experimenting, and that's my caveat, that's my disclaimer, because behind me you can see that we don't have a very impressive plot that we're standing in. So we're in plot D at the Northeast Farm. The plot history of this particular plot, well, let me just share with you what the cover crop mix for these next series of plots looks like. This was a cover crop mix basically established by NRCS as what we would call a very common, affordable, diverse mix that most landowners would likely agree to plant, $15 or so per acre, including radishes, rapeseed, flax, crimson clover, oats, millet, peas, Sudan grass, turnips, sun hemp, and safflowers. Now, at any particular seed house, you might get forage oats versus oats or forage peas versus peas, but generally speaking, it covers the suite of cover crop species pretty well. Here at plot D, what our plot history looks like is again, prior to 2018, it was just a corn soybean rotation, and in 2018 we planted into no-tilled bean stubble on this site. So the entire plot was planted to that mix of cover crops that I just explained. In 2018, that cover crop mix was very healthy, very robust. It looked like, you know, your dream cover crop. Beautiful stand. I did end up clipping it 3 times that summer. It was growing so profusely, but we did have some Canada thistle and other things coming into that. So I just clipped it high just to top off those thistles. But by the end of the growing season, we had a phenomenal stand of covers, and we were very happy with that. So we felt that we were setting the stage for a very good test. Now, because of the heavy cover crop residue in the spring of 2019, I made the decision to burn their cover crop residue. And this is just a little bit of a side note, but for those of you watching, if you choose to burn cover crop residue, which not many people I think have done, it certainly was an eye-opener for me. I've got 20 years of fire experience, and I was incredibly surprised in late April how volatile the fuel load was for a cover crop. Something to keep in mind, that typically you would never burn cover crop residue. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of why you have covers in the field. But for our purposes, we needed to drill into that cover crop with a no-till drill, and we felt that there was just a little too much residue to really get a good seed to soil contact. Now, that was the spring of 2019. During the growing season then of 2019, so when we planted, to my north or to my left, was strictly the CP37 mix. This was just the native plant mix. To the right of me, or to the south, was the native plant mix and a full rate cover crop mix planted together. And NRCS wanted to experiment with that a little bit to see if that would serve as a nurse crop, etc. Now, last year's growing season, we had very dismal results, both in the covers and the natives. They just didn't come well at all. And last year looked very much like this year is looking. Here we are in July of 2020, and you can see the site, if you can see what I'm seeing, is dominated by green and yellow foxtail, ragweed, some perennial sow thistle, and Canada thistle. I did mow it already once this year, trying to stimulate any kind of native response. So I did mow it low one time back in June, but we are not getting really any germination of our natives. There are some. I mean, there's a scattered yarrow, slender wheat, Canada wild rye, bergamot, sunflowers. They are present, but they're very, very scattered, very suppressed in this community, on both sides, where we went with the straight natives and where we went with the native and the cover mix. So what will be of this plot, really time will tell. We do know that sometimes native species, for whatever reason, do take some time to take hold and catch. So we're not writing this off as a failure yet, but it does give us pause as to the potential impact of those cover crops. But I want to be clear, in all I'm going to show you with these cover crop plots, again, all of those natives were planted in 2019. So we have potentially 2 culprits. One is that the cover crop pre-cropping somehow suppressed our plant community, or that we simply planted in a very poor growing year in 2019 for some reason. Now, I don't have a plot that was planted straight into native species in 2019 that didn't have some influence of cover crops to somehow tease that out for you. But the reality is what we're standing in is what we've got to deal with. And time will tell whether we can tease out whether it was a cover cropping issue on these plots or whether it was just the year that we planted. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the Northeast Research Farm. Again, it's July 27th. We are at plot C now. Again, this is the second of our cover crop trial plots that we've introduced in this series of videos. This plot in particular is one that we established as what would be a CRP management protocol, again, post-establishment. So this plot, the intention is that once it's established, again, we established it using cover crops. Once established, it would be more or less a hands-off plot managed within the rules of the CRP management. So what's different about the previous plot is that this particular plot didn't experience any prescribed fire. I had forgotten to mention in the plot D, contrary to plot D, where we did use, again, some prescribed fire in the spring of 2020 to help stimulate that plant community, which ultimately we are not seeing any results. This plot did not receive that fire. And honestly, the results of this plot are very similar. Same methodologies for establishment: into bean stubble, no-tilled, planted with cover crops in 2018, a phenomenal stand of cover crops, again in 2018, mowed a couple times in 2018 just to clip off the tops of those weed heads, and then by the fall of 2018 it was shoulder high cover crops. In 2019, I did again burn the cover crop stubble in order to be able to drill, and again we drilled native seed only in the north half and a native and cover mix in the south half. That was last year. And last year we did clip it again in the year of that native cover mix. I got to say that we were sorely disappointed again in the establishment of the natives in these plots. Very similar to the previous plot. We've got a not as much ragweed and foxtail, but this plot is more or less dominated by ragweed and Canada thistle. And I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera. Again, there are some indicators of some germinating natives. I've got some Canada wild rye in front of me. I've got some side oats grama coming. I've got some slender wheatgrass near me, and a few sprigs of our sunflowers, our coneflowers, our yarrow, but by and large it's a very sparse native plant community. I would have hoped that the fire on the previous plot would have woken our native plant community up, but as I said, there's really no difference, as of yet anyhow. Now, one thing that is very important to point out at this particular plot, and is an interesting phenomenon going in our plots, what we're seeing is a series of plots, and we're looking west if you visit the farm, and we're near the south edge of our plots. And this first 15 yards or so, 10, 15 yards, very, very, very heavy Canada thistle infestation through all of the plots. We think that's probably some type of a carryover of the previous cropping history or something, because it's a hard line. You can see it on my flag here to the south of me. You can see how dominant that Canada thistle population is. Whereas to the north of me, now this was all mowed at the same time, you can see there's quite a line here with even things like our perennial south thistle coming even a little better. So I really can't explain this line, why this line is here, but it does appear that there's a line there, and it could have to do with historic management, and that's about the best that I can speculate at this time. Okay, welcome back to the Northeast Research Farm. It's July 27th. Now we are entering into a series of plots that have one more variable. The next 4 plots were established on previous wheat stubble. And the reason we were lucky enough to take advantage of that and capture that is that in the restoration world, there's been some question over time whether establishing grass into existing wheat would be a desirable option. Given that wheat has some tendency to potentially be allelopathic, it's not well understood, and so largely the restoration community has kind of avoided that, probably more on lack of knowledge or lack of trials than necessarily true experience. It just seems like hedging your bet against it might have made sense. So what we are here, I've already introduced you to the mixes, the cover crop mixes, and the native seed mixes are the same for these plots. We're not doing any CRP trials necessarily on these plots. We are just trying to determine whether cover crops, tillage, no tillage, wheat may or may not have any kind of an impact. So we're at plot W1 right now, which again was wheat stubble in 2017. Now this plot was tilled in the spring of 2018, and then it was planted entirely to cover crops in 2018. And again, a very healthy, very robust stand of cover crops as a pre-crop during that period of time. Again, I mowed it high in 2018, and I should explain that because we're at a research farm, the allowance of establishment of noxious weeds, we wanted to make sure that we were doing our due diligence. So any of these cover crops that I said that we clipped high was because we were seeing a little bit of a Canada thistle or some other invasion of these weeds that we wanted to suppress in order to give a better trial. Again, so this was clipped high in 2018 a few times. Now in 2019, as I explained in a previous plot, I burned off the residue. The cover crop residue was fairly heavy, and we did burn that off in late April in order to ensure that we had good seed to soil contact in our drilling of additional covers and natives. So that was our spring of 2019. It was burned. And then again, we did a drilling of natives only to my left or to the north. And you can see the line behind me that the flag represents. Drilling of natives only, and then a 2019 drilling of natives and a full rate cover crop mix at the same time. Okay, just to see what would happen. And as you can see behind me, we have quite a stark difference down this line. Some due to management, and I'll explain that in a little bit, is that in the growing season of 2019, I mowed our native half low, which is typical of what I would typically do or what we would typically do in the industry to knock down any weed pressure. Those natives can really take a low mowing. In fact, they can take a mowing with a lawnmower that first growing season. You really can't hurt them. Whereas on the south half, because we were trying to see if that cover would serve as a nurse crop, but I still had some weed pressure, so I mowed it high in 2019, just to allow that nurse crop theory to kind of play itself out, okay? Now here in the spring of 2020, interestingly, the entire plot was burned. And the fire was meant to stimulate those native species. We're past the cover crops, and to stimulate those natives, as we know that fire can do. And then since the fire was conducted in late May, and then I did clip this south side to my right here, because as you can see, unfortunately, there's very little desirable coming here. It's a lot of ragweed and green and yellow foxtail, with only a scattered occurrence of a yarrow or a Canada wild rye. I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I'm theorizing that weed pressure may be hindering our natives, or possibly it's that cover crop interseeding that may be suppressing them from last year, or maybe it was the planting season. I don't know, but there's quite a difference to our north. Now, I would not call this a very grand establishment of our natives, but when compared between the two, it's much better. It certainly doesn't hold a candle to some of the other plantings that I've showed you already in this series, but we do have some Canada wild rye coming, and we've got yarrow, and I see there's a scattered coneflower here and there. Very few, if any, native warm season grasses, and we still have a very, very heavy infestation of green and yellow foxtail and some of our bull thistle and some musk thistle. Certainly not a desirable outcome, but again, much better than what I showed you off here to the south on this particular plot. Again, time will tell. I'm reluctant to say that it's the wheat that is suppressing the wheat history, although that could possibly be playing into it. But we will see some other plots where that seems to, where the wheat really doesn't seem to be a factor. So we'll move on to the next plot. All right, welcome back to the Northeast Farm. We're going through our grass management plots. It's July 27th, and we are on the second of what we are calling our wheat plots. These were plots that were established into wheat stubble. We're in plot W4, which is very similar to the previous plot W1 that I just showed you. Mostly the same history, other than this one was not tilled. So this is a no-till wheat field. W1 was tilled in the spring of 2018. This particular plot that we're looking at today, or here, was planted fully to cover crops again in 2018 as a precursor or prep for our natives. Grew well in 2018. We did, again, like I've explained on the other plots, I clipped it high a couple times just to suppress some weeds and then let the covers just go for the remainder of the growing season. In 2019, I did burn off the cover crop residue prior to us planting the native and the cover mix. So again, to the north of me or to my left was drilled native only, and to the south or to my right was a native and cover mix. So the real difference on this plot is that it was no tilled versus that the previous one was tilled. Now, results are arguably very similar. This plot has a lot of Canada thistle, a lot of ragweed, and a lot of green or yellow foxtail within the plot. The difference that you see may be that this particular one, I mowed the entire plot low once this spring. It was mowed last year during that establishment phase. Again, I tried to mow low on the native side a couple times just to stimulate those natives last year. And again, all of the tricks in the bag of tricks just don't seem to be really stimulating this plant community. I was able to burn across the whole thing this spring in the hopes, and that was a May burn, in the hopes of stimulating that native plant community. And again, you can see the results are pretty dismal. There's a few scattered natives. Again, we can see a few sunflowers, a few yarrows, some Canada wild rye. But largely our native plant community is pretty dismal, with little to no response of even our native warm season grasses, which are typically always stimulated by a mid to late May fire. So again, time will tell. We have a few variables here. Was it the cover crop influence? Was it the planting year and timing, which sometimes that does matter? Or was it potentially the wheat influence? But whatever's going on here, we don't have I would not say we have a successful plot yet at this time. All right, welcome back to the Northeast Farm at our grassland management plots. It's July 27th. And we are now into the third of our wheat plots, where we established some of our restoration plots on wheat stubble. In this plot, what I'm going to show you as I talk through it is the variable that we're going to point out the most difference on here is what a well-timed spring fire can do when other things are equal. So just to recap, it was wheat stubble prior to our planting in 2018. In the spring of 2018, we did till this site as typical with our other tilled trials, disked to about a 3 to 4 inch level, made black. But this entire plot was planted to native plants only, no cover crops used in this establishment. That was planted and drilled in the spring of 2018. And then during that 2018 season, I mowed it very, very low across the whole plot to help suppress the weeds, give stimulation to those that native plant community. So you might ask why. You can obviously see there seems to be a very stark line to my left and to my right with the plant community. And what the difference is that in the spring of 2019, I conducted a prescribed fire actually on the east side. Now that was conducted in April, okay? Late April, when all the other fires were conducted, because I wanted to ensure that we had some consistency in our management. Now I've said many times that fire timing is essential to fire effect. And in this particular plot, I believe that fire was early, because what came back in the growing season of 2019 on the east half of this plot was a tremendous weed pressure with Canada thistle and other things that I believe we probably stimulated with the fire. Now in the spring of 2019, to my west or to my right, I did not conduct a fire. And certainly there was still weed pressure there. But that half of the plot seemed to have much less weed pressure last year, which would have been 2019. The east half, because of that weed pressure, got also mowed high in 2019, trying to at least knock off the tops of those weeds while allowing the natives to come. Now here's the difference maker. In the spring of 2020, the entire plot was burned in late May. And you can see that likely that burn stimulated what was remaining or what was coming with these native plants to my east or to my left, but they already had gone through a pretty hard year of competition, and so it's quite sparse. To the west, with a well-timed fire in the spring of this year, you can see that we stimulated a lot of our native grasses, okay? Now what's interesting in these wheat plots, again, this was not cover cropped, so we can't point to cover crop as a potential culprit, but we still don't have a great forb community, a great native forb community. We've got big blue stems coming, we've got scattered Canada wild rye, we've got some switchgrass that's coming, but not a great diversity in the plot. Some bee balm, some of our sunflowers, but it's not a very great diverse plot. As far as wildlife habitat and cover, certainly can serve a purpose, but you can also see that it's got a tremendous infestation even yet on both sides of green and yellow foxtail, which is likely part of the reason that the community is suppressed. Whether the wheat stubble itself, that wheat influence, has suppressed this planting or not, we don't know at this time, but we'll find out as we go forward. All right, welcome back to the Northeast Farm. We're at the Grassland management plots, and this is the fourth of our wheat trial plots. This is plot W3, and again, this plot did not use any cover crops. So in comparison to the previous plot that I just showed you, what the difference is that this plot was not tilled prior to planting the natives back in the spring of 2018, whereas the previous one was. As far as management techniques on this particular plot, again, it was no tilled and it was planted to a full prairie mix, the CP37 mix, in the spring of 2018, and then it was mowed low to suppress weeds across the entire plot that first growing season in order to suppress those weeds and hopefully give those natives a boost. Like I said, you can't really over mow your native plant community in that first year. What happened here then as far as management over time is that in the spring of 2019, we did burn the east half of this plot, and we did not burn the west half, okay? Similar to the previous plot. The difference maker in that is that the previous plot was tilled. And you remember, if you go back and watch that video, the heavy infestation of green or yellow foxtail in that plot. This plot was not tilled, and so it had essentially the same burn regime. Burned over here in spring of 2019, unburned on this side. In the growing season of 2019, you would have seen quite a stark difference in the expression of species on both of these plots. But again, all of it, the entire plot was then mowed high during 2019. Now, in the spring of 2020, I conducted a May fire that was really intended to stimulate that native plant community and suppress the weeds. Again, all of it was mowed high in June of this year as well. And as you can see, there does appear to be somewhat of a line behind me. And what I think is interesting about the line is that it would appear that we have just a little better overall diversity to the west than we do maybe to the east, but possibly not. All of the species are here. I guess what we're seeing on the west is that we've got a little bit more switchgrass coming, and we also have some perennial sow thistle coming. But if you can see into this plot, it's by far the best of our wheat plots. We've got a full expression of our native forbs with our black-eyed Susans and our sunflowers and our coneflowers and our yarrows and our wild bergamot or bee balm, slender wheat. We've got Canada wild rye. We've got our switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass, purple prairie clover, gray coneflower. It's all in this plot, which makes me think possibly that the wheat itself is really not an issue. That if wheat suppression was, or that potential allelopathy was an issue, we should have seen it consistent across all the plots. I also believe that we didn't use any cover crops here, so we don't have that as a factor, one way or the other. Again, it was planted in 2018, so that does seem to be, at least on paper, our better response of our natives. But again, all of our wheat plots that were planted in 2018 should really have expressed the same. So what's the difference? And maybe it's the tillage. This was a no-till, no cover crop plot, and it does appear, and then managed with appropriately timed fire, and it does appear to be the healthiest one of our 4 wheat stubble plots. So again, we'll see what happens over time, but that's where this plot is at today. Welcome back to the SDSU Northeast Research Farm. We are finishing up our grass plots tour for 2020. It's July 27th. And these last few plots that we're going to describe are what we're calling our bulk native seed harvest plots. Now this is a seeding technique that's used a lot in the private NGO agency world, where we broadcast bulk harvested native seeds that were combined or otherwise gathered off of a native prairie and plant them. In contrast to that mix that we previously described, which would be like a hand CP37 mix with about a dozen species. This one's got upwards of close to 40 species harvested and then distributed on the site via broadcasting instead of drilling. So off to my left is, or to the east here, is our plot 1, bulk harvest plot 1, and that was basically, these plots that we're going to show you are typical corn soybean rotation prior to the fall of 2019. So this, we broadcast bulk harvested native prairie species into standing soybeans in the fall of 2019. The theory there is that those beans prior to harvest, the seed would fall on the bare soil, and then we'd go back and harvest the beans, and the bean duff would fall on the seed and insulate the seed and incorporate that seed through the freeze-thaw cycle over the winter. To the right of me is bulk harvest plot 2. Very similar approach, but it's just that this one was broadcasted after the bean harvest, so it was broadcast on top of the bean stubble. Again, last fall. So we're in the first year, or the first growing season for both of these plots. There's not much to show yet. The native species aren't really expressing themselves at this time. I mowed the entire plot low back in June, and what we can see is what's not atypical of a restoration project, where we've got a lot of invaders coming in, taking advantage. Green foxtail, lamb's quarters, ragweed, We got some volunteer wheat, some volunteer soybeans. Very typical response that can happen. I'm a little concerned about the lack of native response. And again, there was no buffer year on this. We're coming right out of cropping, right out of crop history. So corn and beans over time, chemical residue, depending on what they treated these sites with, which is a little difficult to pin down, but we could be potentially seeing some suppression from chemicals, possibly, or it could be just a result of the growing season, the year, the planting, etc. I will say that in some cases where we do this, we get a phenomenal catch the first year. We're not seeing that here yet. So again, time will tell. Future management will be likely possibly one more mowing this year, mowing low, and then getting into prescribed fire and mowing as we go forward. All right, welcome back to the Northeast Farm, SDSU Extension Research Grassland plots. This is the final stop in our series of plots for the 2020 season. And what we're standing in now is a couple of plots that are, again, experimenting with cover crops in relation to bulk harvested native prairie seed. So to the left of me, this is plot 3, or to the east. And what this plot is a spring broadcast. And again, this was bean stubble, no tilled. It was planted to a broadcast mix of native bulk harvested prairie seed and cover crops this spring. Okay, as you can see, there's some sorghum coming. There's a lot of forage oats coming. We have a pretty heavy ragweed infestation, and there are some early season successional native plants coming. But more or less, it's not a very impressive stand of cover crops. Could be because of the spring planting technique, the broadcasting, whatever. Obviously the oats caught, but a lot of our variety in our covers, the radishes, turnips, etc., really didn't show up in any force. To the right of me, or to my west, is the exact same thing, except that it doesn't have any of the natives in it. It's just a cover crop pre-cropping. The idea here is that we want to compare both sides, because maybe what we need to do here is allow this side that first year to allow any chemical residue carry over to essentially exit the system. So the idea here is we're going to go in and broadcast the native bulk harvest seed this fall as a dormant seeding into this standing cover crop. And we'll see if that catches and it gives us a good crop of native plant community going forward. So this one's obviously in process. We probably are not going to conduct any additional management on these sites this year, save for possibly topping this with a high mow, just to kind of knock some of this late season competition down to my left on site 3. So thank you for joining us for this tour. We'll be offering more in the way of education on these sites with our Grassland Management School, and you can contact me at any time for more information on that. Thank you.